So I want to talk to you a little bit about the cemeteries here in New Orleans. St. Louis number 1, which is about 6 blocks down that way, is the oldest extant or continually operating cemetery here in New Orleans, but it's not the oldest, I mean not by a long shot. The first burial ground, like way back at the founding of the city, that was over by the banks of the Mississippi. The only spot in the entire neighborhood where they could dig 6 feet down without hitting water. Water table back then was only about 4 to 6 feet down depending on where you dig. But they quickly realized that digging graves into the levee was a problem because it weakened it considerably. So they decided to found an official cemetery outside of what was then the boundary of town. The city used to end over at Dauphine Street, about a block from where I'm at right now. And they called it St. Peter's, and I am currently standing on it. Well, technically not. Most of it was across the street, but it's much more dramatic to say I'm standing on it. So St. Peter's was the first officially consecrated cemetery here in New Orleans, and it was a below-ground cemetery and in a low-lying area of the French Quarter, so people just accepted at that point that the bodies were gonna get a little soggy. What they would do to ensure that the coffins would stay down in the sort of below-ground muck that's beneath our feet right now is that they would drill holes in the bottom and in the side of the coffin. And then a big guy, a gravedigger, would jump on it like this. He'd go, make sure that it would, fill up with water and stay down there. They would do this after the family had left, by the way. It wasn't during the benediction. You know what I mean? They didn't just say, the Lord bless thee and keep thee. Get down! Get down! That would not be appropriate. So, as you can imagine, this was a pretty simple solution to the problem, but apparently it worked. It couldn't have been complete rubbish because it was in use for almost 60 years. But that didn't mean that it all, went swimmingly the entire time. For example, there is some folklore that has come down to us from the 18th century that basically describes big rains coming through, Burgundy Street here flooding, and coffins shooting up to the surface like champagne corks. Now, I think this is very plausible because it still happens. We had some real bad floods in Livingston Parish in 2016. Thankfully, not many people passed away during that flood event, but they recovered quite a few bodies anyway, bodies that have been dead for a long time. So here's where these stories from the 18th century, I think, fall very safely into the camp of like an urban legend, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway just because it's fun. So the story goes that when the rains would come through and the bodies would come up, that basically 18th century New Orleanians would run out into the floodwaters to try and, gather up their loved ones, put them back together, put them back in the coffin, because presumably the coffin lids would fly open and, the body parts, they would just kind of, flop all over the place, get dismembered like the Evil Dead. And so you'd have to put them back together again like Humpty Dumpty. And this was impossible, though that was the thing, because, everybody else's grandma was also in the floodwaters, so you'd end up with a bit of a Frankenstein. So you'd be out all day gathering up body parts, bring it home to the kids, say, kids, I found grandma, and they'd say, well, that's grandma, but that is definitely not grandma. I don't remember that tattoo. So whether this happened or not, clearly this is not the most efficient way to bury our dead in this climate. And you're probably expecting me to say that, in 1789, famous New Orleanian Jean-Luc Picard came up with the brilliant idea of burying above ground, and he also invented video on demand, and there's a big statue of him outside of the Superdome going, but no, that'd be giving us a little bit too much credit. We started building St. Louis number 1 above ground, not because it was practical, but actually because it was fashionable. Yeah, these big opulent above ground tombs were like the hot new thing in France and Spain. But what we would discover is that building above ground cemeteries in this climate would solve these problems that we have been dealing with and do it in a way that no one really could have predicted. I made a video about burial practices in our cities of the dead that I will link wherever the cards come up at. You can watch that if you're interested. So, a little bit about the archaeology of St. Peter's Cemetery before we part ways. Now, we knew generally where it was for a long time, for centuries, but nobody knew for sure, and by that I mean, there wasn't sort of an archaeological dig uncovering St. Peter's until 2011. Because the owner of a condo on this block, he was building a pool in his courtyard. And, brought in some archaeologists from LSU to make sure that, everything was going to go swimmingly. They dug some trenches and they made some amazing discoveries. They found several nearly complete skeletons, many of them still in their coffins. They also found grave goods on the bodies, such as seeds, indicating that somebody put flowers in the coffin. And what made it really fascinating was that when they DNA tested those bones, they found that pretty much everybody that they dug up was of African descent. In fact, most of them were of mixed African and Native American descent. And because a lot of the bones showed signs of wear and tear and repeated injury, I think it's a pretty good guess that that was the slave section. So this is actually the first hard evidence that I'm aware of, at least, which confirms the cultural and oral traditions of Mardi Gras Indians, who are basically black folks who claim descent from Native Americans. Typically the story is, that, my ancestor, he ran away and he met up with the Choctaw and started a family. Now that was actually a super common practice amongst Native American tribes in North America. Not just here in Louisiana. I mean, all over the place. Because tribes that were ravaged by disease or by warfare, they found themselves short on men. They would often induct or kidnap a white or a black man into the tribe to marry the dead man's wife, take care of his kids, and essentially take over his responsibilities within their tribe. Though I think it's just as likely that a lot of these unions started in slavery, especially here in Louisiana, because Native Americans were enslaved right alongside Africans in the early days of our history. So the pool was finished. You'll be happy to hear this. The pool was finished. It is now nicknamed the Pool of Souls, which I know sounds like a place where a Nazi would trap Indiana Jones, but no, it is an actual place where you can go swimming here in the city.
Son of a bitch.